Hey Grandmasters, it's Mike from the WCA. We're taking a look at the final position from Rusa's game that we analyzed in class. We're going to look at this from the beginning, but we're very, very proud of her. She finished third overall at the U.S. Championship, and that was a terrific, terrific result for her. So we're going to take a look. She's playing Ilana Katz from the United States, and Ilana is a very strong player, one of the youngest in the tournament, and she had Rusa in the last round with the white pieces. And it was important that Rusa win this game because she was tied with two other women going into the last round. And fortunately for her, they both lost their games. And when Rusa pulled this one out, she was able to take a clear third place. Okay, let's take a look from the beginning. And Ilana with the white pieces opens with e4. And Rusa has been playing the Sicilian for many years and almost exclusively will play c5 against e4. And knight f3 indicates we're going to see an open Sicilian, which we've discussed in class, and I'll explain it more in a moment. Lots of moves black can play, but e6 is Rusa's choice, and Ilana plays d4, which is going to open the game when white will trade their d pawn for black's c pawn, as you see here. C takes, knight takes, and if you look carefully with that exchange of pawns, the board is beginning to open up. There's more lines for the pieces to come out, and that's why they call this an open Sicilian. Still an opening theory here. Rusa plays a6. This is known as the Kahn or the Paulson variation. And the idea of a6 is a little difficult to see right now. She's going to place her queen at c7 at some point, and when she does, she might not want a knight hopping into that square into b5 to bother the queen. A6 also allows the b pawn for black to push, possibly to b5, gaining some space, opening some lines for the light squared bishop up on c8. So it's kind of a hard move to understand at the beginner level because it appears that black is not developing anything. They're moving a pawn, but there is definitely a purpose behind this pawn structure. So let's go a little further in the opening, and that will become more clear. Bishop to d3. Developing the bishop, queen to b6, and here is kind of a trade of tempos. The women were playing with a time control where they had to make 40 moves in 90 minutes, and once they made their 40th move, they would be given an extra half hour of time. So what queen b6 does, in the actual game, Ilana played knight to b3, running away from the queen, and then Rusa put her queen on c7. Which is basically where she wanted it to go anyway. But by doing this, she's actually picked up a couple of moves, getting her closer to move 40. Also, the women were playing with an increment, meaning every time they completed a move, they were given an extra 30 seconds of time. So this little maneuver looks like she's losing a tempo, but she's really not. She's gaining some clock time, and the knight on b3 right now isn't so scary. So it's kind of worth this little back and forth maneuver. So knight c3, developing the knight, and black obviously needs to get some pieces out. So knight f6, castles, pawn d6, and a4. Now the idea behind a4 is that pawn may push forward again and grab some more space for white and start taking some squares in Rusa's territory. So to prevent that and to also help her develop, she plays the pawn move b6. Now, it's at this point I want you to take a look at these markers. If you look at Rusa's pawn structure, the black pawn structure, you'll notice that those pawns at the top of the board are guarding 6 squares. And this formation that she's setting up is known as a hedgehog formation. And it gets its name, as you would guess, from an animal like a hedgehog or a porcupine, which kind of just sits back and waits for you to attack. And if you do, you have to make sure you don't get caught on a porcupine's quills, or in this case, into that hedgehog formation. It's very, very solid and very difficult to break through. If you look at it from the white side, here I highlighted the 2 pawns, one on a4 and one on e4. And why we highlight those pawns, as we discussed in class, is white has more space. The space you get in chess is determined by the room you have behind your pawns. So the further your pawn goes up the board, the more space the pieces have behind those pawns to work. If you look at the black position right now, they're kind of crouched, they're kind of hunched or pushed in behind those pawns, which makes it a little difficult for them to maneuver. The plus side is it's not so easy to crack the hedgehog formation. So in order to do that, Ilana is going to set up her pieces, push one more pawn, and then try to push everything into Rusa's position. Let me show you the moves and it will become clear. She plays Queen E2. That's not a random move off the back row just to connect the rooks. The queen on E2 is there to support the E-pawn. And the E-pawn in the future is going to have an opportunity to push forward into black's position, and it's very helpful to have the heavy pieces, those are your rooks and your queens, behind pawn pushes. Actually, any piece that supports a pawn push is helpful, but when you have rooks and queens behind those pawns, if those files ever open up, then the heavy pieces are very well placed behind those pawns. And you'll see in a moment the main weapon that white is going to throw at black. So Rusa plays bishop to e7, developing move, giving her the option to castle, and here comes perhaps one of the main attacking weapons against hedgehog or these types of Sicilians, and it's the pawn move f4. And what that does, let me highlight something for you. Those two pawns side by side, that's known as a pawn duo, like the word duet, two singers singing together. Here, a pawn duo, or when two pawns go up the board side by side, and when that's created, it gives white, in this case, a lot of opportunity how to use those pawns. If you look at those pawns, they're controlling lots of squares. They have the option of pushing forward, and it makes it very difficult for black to calculate. For example, is white going to leave both pawns? Is white going to push one? If they're going to push a pawn, which pawn are they going to push? It makes it very difficult for black to play, not knowing in the future what those pawns are going to do. So, Rusa doesn't react right away. She develops another piece, knight to d7, and here in this case, the knight doesn't go to c6 because she wants to keep the diagonal open for her light squared bishop. As you'll see in a moment, all of this is going to become very clear. Bishop d2, again, not a random move. The bishop moves to allow the rook in the corner, the rook on a1, to slide into the game. After Rusa castles, that rook that we're talking about slides in behind the queen, and now all of the heavy pieces are lined up behind that pawn duo, helping them advance, and when they do advance, they're going to advance with a little bit more force. So here Rusa plays an important move. Because she's not clear what Ilana is going to do with those pawns, she more or less forces her to declare her intentions. So she plays the pawn move e5. And by playing e5, by throwing that pawn into the pawn duo, she's going to force white to make a decision as to what to do. In the game, she pushed past and played f5. But, for example, what if she had taken the knight instead, the pawn instead on e5? Then Rusa could recapture with her knight. And if you look carefully, that knight on e5 right now is pretty well secure. Pushing those pawns up the board may have been helpful in one respect for white, but a downside to that is that there are no pawns that could ever chase that knight out of e5. That would become known as a permanent knight. It's a very, very strong piece. So going back to the move Ilana played, she closed off that area and created this very cool pawn chain. Now I'm calling it a pawn chain because the bishop that's in the middle of those highlighted pawns is obviously not a pawn, but it's acting like one here. It's kind of making this fence all the way up, and I drew the arrow, and this is a great trick that most of our WCA students know, and if you don't know, it's a really good time to learn it here, that whenever you see a pawn chain, look at the bottom of the chain. In this case, it would be the pawn on c2. Draw an arrow to the top of the chain. That would be the pawn on f5. for you, and then push that arrow all the way to the top of the board. That's a good indication of where you should be playing on the board. It means you have a lot of space there. And if you kind of focus your eyes on that fence, you'll see that all the space inside that pawn chain belongs to Alana. And she's going to use that space to create an attack against Rusa. Well, Rusa's a very experienced player. She knows what's coming. So she prepares for her counter-strike by developing her last piece. And she plays bishop to b7. Now, counter-strike, what do we mean by that? Well, Alana plays g4. This is a pawn storm that's kind of rare because you're pawn storming with the pawns that are in front of your king. The king on g1 is a little bit exposed right now, but because of that beautiful chain, it's very hard for Rusa to break through. So that pawn is intending to move up further and come into g5. Now, Rusa is known for many years, obviously at the master level and international master level. They know that, but our students know this too, that one of the best ways to attack when you're getting attacked on the side of the board is to strike in the center. And that's exactly what she does. And she plays the move d5. And by playing d5, she's going to cause some disruption, or she's going to cause some possible tactics by creating play in the middle. So now, when Alana continues on the side, as she did with the move g5, Rusa can now take the pawn on e4 because it's supported by the pawn on d5, the pawn she just pushed. Well, here we have an exchange. Bishop takes, pawn takes, and it looks like white can just take back the pawn on e4, but she takes a little bit of a risk here. She takes a gamble. And if you put this on a computer, it's going to say that white's decision was not sound, meaning it was better for black. So instead of taking back, she played the move bishop to e3. Now, again, we always caution you about using computers to analyze your positions, because the computer will calculate things accurately. It doesn't get tired. It doesn't get nervous. It doesn't care how much time it has on its clock. You have to remember, this game was being played in the last round of the U.S. Championship with real clocks ticking. So from a human perspective, you're not aware that a computer is telling you that you're better. All you're aware of is your opponent sacrificed a pawn, and now you have to figure out why. Well, you can pause the video if you want and look at this position for a while, and what you'll see is that bishop that went to e3 actually creates another wall. There's this line, the rook on e1, the queen on e2, the bishop on e3. I can actually show you, draw another arrow for you quickly here. And you'll see that arrow, that area is sort of blocked off. And that could create a problem for Rusa in case any of her pieces need to get over to defend her king. Now, that obviously can be a problem if white decides to attack. So that was the main idea of Alana playing bishop e3. So Rusa doesn't stand there. She decides to go for some activity on the queen side where she has space, bishop to b4, and then, very cool move, pawn f6. And those are known as either destructive sacrifices or pawn wedges, all types of moves designed to weaken squares near the king, especially the area that she wants to attack. So Rusa doesn't panic. She doesn't rush in and start moving the pawns in front of her king. She plays rook a to c8, putting more pressure on the c-file. Alana plays rook to d1, and that's going to slow the queen up, the black queen, from moving around the board, because then the knight on d7 would be hanging. Bishop takes knight is going to shatter the pawns in the queen side and create some targets for later in the game. And you'll see after that capture that the pawns on the queen side are in fact very, very weak. Now, black has to turn her attention to the king side for a moment. Over the board, it was possible for Rusa to play the move pawn to g6, and that would have clogged everything up and stopped the attack for now. But again, a human, it's very, very difficult to play a move like that because of ideas queen g4, and if you give Alana enough time, she's going to be able to slip in there and possibly get to Roos's king. For example, let's just take a look at a quick line here. Rook f to d8, queen h4. Now it's pretty clear where she's going. That queen wants to come into h6 and then checkmate on g7. But black would have had this nice little maneuver, knight f8, and then if the queen comes into h6 to attack, the knight could hop to e6 and protect the square. Now it's very, very easy for me to show this line. Black is actually in great shape here, but there's no way that you're going to see all of this with a clock running in a real tournament game. Now it's possible Rusa can, but it's not worth calculating all that when in a real game, when instead you can just play a waiting move as she did, like king h8. Now it looks like a mistake because it allows the pawn to take, but the king can take back and actually survive this. It's not comfortable because there's lots of open squares, but it's not so easy for white to get in there. So she plays queen h5, so naturally here comes the attack. Rook c to d8, keeping an eye on the knight, freeing the queen. Queen h3, more pressure on the knight. And then bishop to c8. Now, bishop to c8 gave white an opportunity for a tactic, which she finds here. And she plays a very, very instructive move, a very cool move. She plays pawn to g6. And by doing so, she opens up the dark squared bishop, and she's ready to attack the black king. So Rusa takes with the f-pawn. She talked about going over this with several grandmasters at the tournament, saying that taking with the h-pawn may have been better, but perhaps she wants to trade off those rooks and open the game a bit and take some of the pressure off of her king. But Alana answers with bishop h6, and that's going to win an exchange. It's going to win a rook for a minor piece. But here you have to be very, very careful. Where do you go to get out of check? So I'd like you to pause the video and imagine the king getting out of check. You put it on h8 or g8. Okay. Let's see how you did. If you chose g8, staying off the dark squares, you're in big trouble because of queen e6. Let's take a look at that again. King g8, queen e6 check, king h8, and now queen e7, and in this position black can resign. Major trouble. How to deal with the mate on g7. A move like rook g8, which protects the square, will just run into rook f7, and black's going to lose everything she has. So when she was checked, she had to find king h8. Bishop takes, and again there's a problem. If rook takes, Rusa's in trouble here as well because of rook takes d7. And in this position, how do you take back? You can't take that rook with your queen or your bishop, because if you look at the f file, white would just go up the board and take that rook for free up on f8, and Rusa would be in big, big trouble. So if you try the in-between move, like rook takes rook check, queen takes is also very strong, and again the rook cannot be touched on d7 because of the checkmate up on f8 with the queen. So there was a little trap again. So going back, after the bishop took on f8, Rusa had to take with the knight. Alana plays queen h4, hitting the rook twice. Rusa takes on d1, and here Alana missed an in-between move. In the game, she took the rook on d1, but with a little computer analysis, we found, and grandmaster analysis, we found that queen f6 check was a little bit stronger, because that forces the queens off, and once the queens come off the board, the rook now takes on d1, and let's say a similar move in the game like bishop f5, the rook goes to d6, and it's a very, very active piece. You might be able to play knight to d7 to hold the pawn. The problem is the black pieces are getting tied up, and in this case, the white rook is doing a really good job on d6. So Rusa would, be working for a draw in this position not so easy that it's a clear win for her. Let's look at the game continuation, and you'll see that this would have worked out better for white. So in the game continuation, here, instead of the check, she immediately takes on d1. That allows Rusa to put her king on g7, stopping the white queen from getting in. And here's where Alana starts to go wrong. She takes her rook off the open file and pressures the e-pawn. It looks like it could have been taken right away by the queen, like why not queen takes pawn, but then that would have gotten hit with bishop f5, and there would have been a couple of pawns hanging for white. So Alana plays rook e1 just to keep the pressure on the pawn, attacking it twice, but that allows the bishop to come out, basically saying, hey, if you want to give back the rook for the minor piece, you can do it, but now my bishop's in the game. The rook lifted to e3, blockading the pawn. The problem is that's almost like another free move for Rusa, and she's able to play knight e6, and those pieces are starting to really flow into the game. Knight to d2, and here I want to highlight something for you. The king and the rook are on the same diagonal, and we talked about this in class. Don't miss those opportunities when you see a chance to pin. Rusa plays queen to c5. And after queen to c5, white's in a little bit of trouble here. I just want you to quickly compare this position to when Rusa first captured on f8. Look at all of the black pieces here, and now compare it to this position after the pin. And we can't stress enough the importance for all of you to play as actively as possible with your pieces. Queen f2, broke the pin. Knight jump to f4, king f1 breaking part of the pin, knight to d5, and in this position the rook had to move, and no matter what had happened, there were all sorts of threats coming with the black pieces being strong, so Ilana decides to give back the exchange by taking on e4, and Rusa just has a very simple combination of trading that led to the winning endgame that you saw when you first started the video. Queen takes pawn, queen takes queen, king takes queen, bishop takes rook, knight takes bishop, and in this position, being up a pawn and having to get the better game, as you'll see, knight f6, there's no way that Ilana can make that trade. She'll be down a pawn in the middle of the board. So she played knight g5, knight d7, and I'm going quickly because you'll see the formation that she sets up in a moment. Here's the check. King's going to start coming into the game. Knight c7 attacking one of the pawns, which she moves. King starts to centralize. King starts to centralize. And in this position, Rusa has a winning endgame. I'll just go through the moves quickly without comment. And we'll comment here, the poor knight was forced to go all the way back to h1 to stop that advanced pawn, and then knight e4 check, king d3, knight d6, and another pawn is going to fall, and in this position, Ilana resigned. Hope you enjoyed the game and you remembered what we talked about in class. It's worth going over this again just to get a feel for some of the thinking that goes on at that level, and it was great. We look forward to having Rusa back in class. Okay.